This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Welcome, everybody. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warrenshaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Yeah, man. We dressed to the nines for this one. You know it, man. It's about that time. Of course it is. Shaw and I, man, we live for this. Everybody lives for Halloween. No. This is what we do when we get around the springtime. You know, things blossom, and then what we do, we go and we just kill ish. It's time for us, man, to get right into it, man. It's that year. It's that time of the year. Autopsy report time, man. We got to start talking about those teams that, got to put them on the slab, man. That's how it is, man. And so, but let that be said, that there's still other things that are happening because, hey, we still have NBA regular season to deal with, about a handful of games left to go before we start talking about seeding. So don't get it twisted. We can multitask, right? We can handle the dead and we can also handle the living at the same time, right? Let me go and roll out the red carpet to my right-hand man, www.shawsports.net, Big Kahuna PNC, my man, Mr. Warren Shaw, repping out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. What's good, Dr. Shaw? Are you ready for us to get into our favorite time of the year?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the spirit that we're showing here on this year's edition of the Autopsy Reports on the Baseline NBA podcast. So, you have the full garb on if you're watching us on YouTube. I'm in my surgical scrubs. More stuff to come when we get to the actual surgery part of this episode. But really exciting times here on the Baseline. And yeah, right as we're getting into the playoffs. And interestingly enough, I guess our first topic of conversation is technically somebody whose job is now dead. They called him into the office and said, "Go ahead, your job has a terminal illness. You're going to have to get up out of here." So rough times going on in Memphis, but we'll get to that here in a little bit.
Yeah, talk about a hell of a residency. Oh, by the way, I would like to say, well done, sir. I don't know if you're paying homage to Morris Chestnut and Watson and everything, but the black scrubs with the beard and everything, man, you got it going on, my friend.
I'm trying to be like you. I mean, so like I'm in there like doing the work. You're more like the medical administrator, I think, at this point. You're gonna come out there and tell the people how it went.
I think that you should rename yourself Dr. Watson. I'm completely fine being renamed as Dr. Kill Patients, but we should rename you as Dr. Watson. Listen. The ladies love you, bro. The ladies love you.
Not like they love you, sir, but that's a conversation for another time. That's a whole other podcast.
Anyway, man, we got a great episode on tap. As we were mentioning before, we're going to do our coveted autopsy reports. We got two teams that we're going to put on the slab, namely the Utah Jazz and the Charlotte Hornets. So we can't wait to discuss what the outlook is for them and what the future might actually look like, albeit, though, we talk about the dead. Very seldomly do we see teams like raise up, but we're going to try to give them a little bit of positivity. We're going to try to give them a little bit of a heartbeat as we do our autopsy report. So as always, we appreciate everybody hopping on board with us this week. Be sure to get my man Shaw at Shaw Sports NBA, get at me at Game Face, leave the show's Twitter handle at NBA Baseline, available on all the major platforms. You can go to www.thebaselineNBA.com to check out not just this episode, but also the plethora of episodes that we have dropped for your listening pleasure. If you catch us on the YouTube channel, and obviously you do if you're loving our get up, and you know that we rocks with the 19 Media Group family. You can see the blue and white logo down in the right-hand corner. Be sure to check us out on the YouTube channel. And you can also check out the family of great content creators of the 19 Media Group family. Go to www.19mediagroup.com. So before we get into our coveted autopsy report, got to make sure we do our proper plugs. And listen, man, that time of the year, like I was mentioning earlier before, man, basketball season heating up. Major League Baseball has just started. We got so much happening, but with Prize Picks, baby, you know that you can't go wrong. It's all here for you, right? The race to the playoffs is heating up on Prize Picks, and this is the best place for you to get cash to cash in on your favorite sports. Don't miss on your chance to cash in as the league's best fight for playoff positioning that will be taking place in this upcoming NBA season. And you can now win up to 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. Sign up today and get a $50 bonus instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. You use the promo code CLNS. Prize Picks also offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts and is available in more than 30 states, including California, Texas, Georgia, and Florida. Due to the enormous selection of players and stat types available, we can mix and match our playing strategies based on personal preferences. I might take Jason Tatum for more than 27 points and Drew Holiday for more than 2 steals to mix in some defense in my selections. Do you think Luka Doncic will get more than 5 3-pointers next week, or you think Giannis will drop more than 35? Cook up these hot takes with your friends and win real money this basketball season when you and your crew run your game on Prize Picks. So what are you waiting for? Download the app today and use the code CLNS to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Remember, with Prize Picks, it's as simple as picking more or picking less. Again, the promo code CLNS to get $50 after you play your first $5 lineup. Baseline is rocking with Prize Picks, and you should too. Prize Picks, run your game. Coming up, Sean, I dig into the latest situation down in Memphis. You don't want to miss it here on The Baseline. We're back, and if everybody's been paying attention to what's going on in the news of the association, the latest happenings, again, listen, the NBA, man, don't sleep on the idea that everything is done, in a specific space and time or within a window. If it's about winning, if it's about the money line, these executives and these teams, they don't play. And so the latest in the happenings out there in Memphis is the parting of ways is the best way to put it, between Taylor Jenkins, the head coach of the Memphis Grizzlies, and the organization. And they're doing this with about 10 plus games or less, with the season remaining to go. The Memphis Grizzlies is jostling for playoff position in the Western Conference, somewhere between possibly a 4 seed and a 6 or 7 seed. And I know people, our jaws dropped because of what happened to Luka Doncic. I think I'm more floored by this than I am about the Luka Doncic situation. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but to me, I think it's just unprecedented and unheard of to see that the Memphis Grizzlies felt it necessary to move on from Jenkins, given what Jenkins has given this Memphis Grizzlies team, given what he was dealt with, and where this team has positioned itself and where they are and what's still left to go for them. Very odd situation, and definitely has me scratching my head. This one is a head scratcher.
The Memphis faithful have been indicating, and this is who I've needed to lean on because, we're not there, right? We don't live in the city. We're not avid followers of the team. And everything I've heard is more or less this is a result of Taylor Jenkins in some ways pseudo losing the locker room. 8-11 since the All-Star game, and a sub 500 record against teams with a 500 record, some of the upper echelons in the conferences or in the association in general. Something has kind of shifted. Their defense is not the same. And while we've praised their depth and even some of their player development, they're really struggling in the latter part of the season, and both their offense and defense have had shifted. Part of that too is like they brought in a whole new assistant coaching staff over the off season to try to tweak some of that offense. And then if you listen to ESPN, I want to give them their credit, Windhorst is saying, like, in recent weeks after the struggles, Taylor Jenkins started to regress back to what he felt was a more comfortable offense, as opposed to sticking to what was an offense that was working with a lot of ball movement. But Ja Morant was not having a very good season statistically speaking. So a lot of people were trying to figure out what was the issue there. But what it boils down to, it doesn't seem like there's some nefarious activity from Taylor Jenkins outside of the basketball side, like kind of Ime Udoka style. This seems to strictly be about basketball with a very, very peculiar timing. Obviously, 9 games left at the time of the firing. Now 8 games left as of time of our recording, and in the middle of a playoff hunt where they're actually trying to get home court advantage. Again, it's hard and kind of confusing to kind of really put this into words and understand exactly what the situation is. But for all intents and purposes, this is a basketball decision, although a peculiar one at this point of the season.
Peculiar one, but I again, Shaw, I'm trying to rationalize the good it will actually give you. If what you're saying is by doing this now, you are going to raise those questions. And if you're not going to raise those questions on Taylor Jenkins and you don't speak to it magnanimously, then the next thing that you start looking at is you start looking at the core players. You start looking at the star players and wondering if whether or not they are the ones who had mutinous tendencies in order to elevate this to the degree that it's been elevated. Because it's not like, okay, you're getting rid of Taylor Jenkins and his whole staff. You're getting rid of Taylor Jenkins, but you're keeping on an interim head coach, which, by the way, in Tomasi Salo, has great credentials, right? But he was not Taylor Jenkins' number one guy, right? To your point earlier, that staff had been replaced, and I don't know how much say Taylor Jenkins really had on the kind of people that he wanted as part of that staff. And so to me, I think it raises more questions about the organization if we're really trying to dig into this and what their ulterior motives are and what the ultimate agenda is supposed to be. Now, whether or not this becomes a question of, are we trying to satisfy Ja Morant? Let's also keep in mind that some of the problems the organization, some of the problems that we're seeing from Ja Morant are not problems that I think the organization are going to be able to fix. This is something that Ja Morant has to fix. And whether or not that's within himself or whether or not that's within his game and the mechanics, he's got to figure that part of it out. And he's got to be able to ingratiate himself where he's elevating that team. I think it's great, given the circumstances of what has happened to him in the last year and a half, that he's in the position that he's in. He's not been someone who's made a fuss about his struggles. He's not put it on anything. And I think he's even realistic that he needs another year or so before we start talking about MVP Ja Morant like we did a couple of years ago. But in the meantime, this is why I praise a guy like Taylor Jenkins, because he knew that he wasn't getting all Ja Morant, and so to me, I'm now questioning the organization a whole lot more than I'm questioning whether or not, and I'm not saying I'm a complete fan of Taylor Jenkins. Taylor Jenkins has had, he has his weaknesses, but for all intents purposes, this Memphis Grizzlies team, in my opinion, I think overachieved. I did not see them being a top 5 seed. I saw them maybe being a play-in worthy situation. And given the struggles that some of these other Western Conference teams who exceeded last year's expectations, I thought would have at least improved, they have not. So that is given a window for the Memphis Grizzlies to kind of walk themselves into a better situation, a better place, but none to the degree that you're going to let go the head coach who got you at least a above 500 regular season at the very least, given what the circumstances were at the beginning of the year and the injuries that you suffered throughout the course of the season.
Yeah, I mean, we need to have more information. So I think it's where, we can't have a long conversation on it because there's just not enough information out right now. And
I
even
don't
the
think
most
we'll find out the truth until the end of the season. I think things will
maybe,
start to come out.
But
After
I'll say a couple of things, right? So Taylor Jenkins is obviously the headline because he's the head coach, but they fired Patrick St. Andrews, and Noah LaRoche as well too. So those guys were a part of his assistant coaching staff. So they're all gone, but the majority, I guess, of the new folks that were brought in have in essence kind of stayed. There's so many thoughts here swirling, and so I want to be as concise as possible. When you talk about Taylor Jenkins having to navigate a situation, I think about Doc Rivers, back with the Clippers and some of the things that he had to deal with, and different. But again, this is kind of like non-basketball related stuff that you're having to manage, and the stuff with Ja Morant and, and the firearms and so forth and so forth. And then all the injuries that Taylor Jenkins had to manage. Like, I don't think he could have really done a better job than he did, in that year and a half, 2-year situation. Now, again, all the injuries to Ja this year as well too, and still has his team fighting for a top, home court advantage in the first round. Like it's a little sad, but from the Grizzlies standpoint, for them, I feel like they're like, well, we can't waste time. If we feel like we can really make some semblance of a run this year, we need to do it with a guy who we feel is going to be here long term. And so while peculiar at best, to make this decision now, they clearly must feel like, hey, we have runway to be successful with this roster as currently constructed. We need the right leadership in place to try to extrapolate everything we possibly can out of that. As mercurial as all that is, the day after Jenkins is fired, Ja Morant actually comes back, after a 6-game absence as well too, in a losing effort, but he played well. I don't know. It's not great vibes out there in Memphis, but we'll see what Tomas is able to do with the rest of this roster as they fight for playoff contention, playoff home court advantage, more appropriately, and see where that lands them over the course of this playoffs.
Listen, man, I appreciate how you brought up Doc Rivers, but Why don't we just keep it in-house? Let's go back and look at the record of how the Memphis Grizzlies organization has handled their previous head coaches. And I'll go as far back as to Lionel Hollins, right? You can make the argument how they handled him, and then had Dave Yeager come in. And then after Dave Yeager, you had Fizdale. And then, now you have Jenkins. And let's keep in mind, Jenkins holds the Memphis Grizzlies record for the most wins as a head coach for the Grizzlies, right? So I'm just looking at this and again, if people are paying attention to the lineage and how this basketball team has evolved and what has evolved, the players and everything like that, this is not something that's coming out of thin air. There's a lot more to this, Shaw, and I agree with you. Hopefully we will be able to get more to that and we can speak a little bit more to that. Again, I'm not speaking out of turn. I don't want to make it seem like, oh, I hate the Grizzlies or I think that there's a problem with it. What I'm just saying is that it's very, very odd that you choose to do this at this very moment in time and not think that it's going to raise red flags either as an organization or even those who are considered stars a part of that organization, because somebody is going to have to speak to it. That's how the media operates. And so I feel bad for the Desmond Baines, the Jaren Jackson Juniors and the Ja Morants, because the camera is going to be in front of them. If they don't go out and perform, meaning they don't go out and have a successful first round of the playoffs, if they stay within the playoff seeding, or if they have to actually be in the play-in situation and they get ousted or even get embarrassed, people are going to look back to this situation and say, what of it? So interesting stuff there. So more to come, but definitely great conversation to be had. And unfortunately, again, it just sucks because Taylor Jenkins really is a good coach. And I'm sure he's going to find a landing spot, when this offseason takes place. But
if he wants one, he could find one. He could have a job tomorrow if he wanted one. So, again, he'll probably take some time here, but this is not a guy who we've seen the last of in any stretch of the imagination.
Absolutely. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Coming up, it's that time, baby. Time for us to put a team on the slab and get into our coveted autopsy report. Dr. Watson, Dr. Kill Patience. You don't want to miss it here on The Baseline. We are back, Callie Warren Shaw, Baseline NBA podcast. Time for us to get into our coveted autopsy report. My man, Mr. Shaw, is right here. He got the scalpel ready. Time to open up a team over here. So who we got on the slab, Shaw? Let's talk about the Charlotte Hornets. Another disappointing season for Charlotte. And I think the reason why I want to use the word disappointing is because it's not that when in our predictions, we had any inclination that the Charlotte Hornets were going to catapult themselves into any kind of play-in situation. You had to wonder with the way that this team, again, is structured, that the onus is going to be on the cleverness of Charles Lee in his first year as a head coach to kind of navigate and figure out a way to incorporate hopefully a healthy LaMelo Ball, hopefully a healthy Brandon Miller, I'm not Mikal Bridges. Which other Bridges are we talking about, sir?
Miles Bridges.
Miles Bridges. There you go. Jesus, M&Ms. But Miles Bridges. So it's interesting. We didn't have any high expectations for this team, but it is somewhat disappointing, Shaw, because again, we are faced with that age-old question when it comes to LaMelo Ball. Can he stay healthy for a duration of an NBA season? And because now, again, his season has had to abruptly end due to sustained injuries, the Charlotte Hornets, I don't think will find themselves in any meaningful space years to come until they can figure out a way to construct a roster that has the level of depth when you recognize that one of your top tier players is only going to be available for half of the games if you're lucky. and where that chemistry lies with the rest of the other core players. So a lot of questions to speak of when we're talking about the Charlotte Hornets, but this is why I think of the word disappointment, because it just doesn't feel like they can ever rise up out of the grave with some semblance of being an able-bodied team to be competitive any longer.
I think you're spot on. I also still think there's aspect of the right players, in essence, to give you whatever runway you're trying to, take off from. The Hornets, I don't think, even with Lamelo, they're not a good basketball team, right? They were 16-31 with him in the 47 games he played this year before shutting it down. As we record, that means they were 2-24 when he didn't play. So did he impact winning? Sure. But it was still well below, 500. We're at the point with Lamelo, it's not even about the injuries. I think it's, some people don't think he's a serious basketball player. They're starting to feel like this is an empty calories type of dude that you're going to commit 45, or you have already signed the contract, so $45 to $50 million a year. And is he the person that can get you to the next level, as you try to build around him? Is he somebody you build around, or is he a piece of the puzzle? And right now it would seem more like he could potentially be a piece of the puzzle, but he's not the building block, because his statistics, while inflated, they come at the expense of sometimes alienating some of his teammates as he's playing a lot of one-on-one and shooting the most wildest and ridiculous shots. You could say, well, there's nobody else there to take shots. And maybe that's true, especially after Brandon Miller went down this year. But I'm not convinced that LaMelo is the guy for this Hornets team. Charles Lee and company has a lot to figure out when it comes to that. But I'd be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if they at least field offers, when it comes to trades, he and Miles Bridges, to figure that out. I don't think they're going to move on from Brandon Miller in any way. They also have their number 6 pick, Tajon Salon. He's starting getting a little bit of run here now too. So, another one of the French, connections, if you will, kind of coming into the space. Hasn't really looked like much. Has had a couple of, moments here this season where, he's shot the 3 ball well. He's got decent size, but I don't know if that's the route they want to go, building around Miller, Salon, and Ball, and Mark Williams, who they tried to trade, and now he's back. So I have nothing but questions about this Hornets team, I think, currently. But I think a lot of it starts with what the front office wants to do with LaMelo, making that decision first and foremost. Okay, is he our guy? And now if we get, a top 3, top 5 draft pick this year, what is truly the core of our organization? And that's what needs to be figured out first and foremost.
Shaw, I don't know what you do with this situation, right? What I can say is, if, let's say, for example, you tell me that LaMelo Ball is our guy, what are you actually telling Brandon Miller? I mean, if you really think about it, Brandon Miller, as a scorer and really as a young upstarting player, has received and garnered a lot more attention and respect in that community than I think people are giving credit for. Now, does that necessarily make him the man? See, he doesn't exude the star power like the Ball family, right? And like LaMelo Ball does. In many regards, LaMelo Ball actually is the one in which his basketball game has translated more to the excitement factor of why we were all eyes on the Ball family, Lonzo, him, LiAngelo, all of these cats, right? And I don't know how many more down the chain is probably in the come into the NBA. But the bigger problem that I think you have is the Charlotte Hornets. You have to prioritize, what is it that you want your star player to reflect, right? I'll give you a perfect example, because I think at some point we're going to have this question when we talk about the Washington Wizards, because they're eventually going to get put on this slab very soon, right? And it's the question that I think a lot of people are asking about the kind of guys that you're saying should be the face of an organization. You can have an exciting basketball player. He doesn't have to consume, though, the ideology and the philosophy of how a team operates within the system. I think that if you're Charles Lee, you work a lot more with a guy like Brandon Miller, because Brandon Miller has at least played some form of organized basketball when he came out of Alabama. And you see that in how he carries himself and how he executes. I think you also have the same question. You have a little bit of the same questions with Miles Bridges, but with Bridges, again, he played in a structured level of basketball that's allowed you to be able to see some kind of success in what he does on the basketball court. Whether or not that translates to collectively the Charlotte Hornets having some corner pieces to work with, I think you have to shift again the narrative on whether or not, to your point, we should be focusing on, do we build around LaMelo Ball? Maybe let's not even worry about saying whether or not we're building around LaMelo Ball, but building around a successful group of guys that know how to play within a system that Charles Lee wants to implement. And he leaning on those guys to go out there and executing it the way it needs to be executed. I think, to me, that would be a good start for the Charlotte Hornets. Because to your point, if the focus and the question still becomes, what do we do with LaMelo Ball? They are going to be doomed for failure, regardless of whether or not they're planning to keep or look to move him. I think the focal point is really understanding what Charles Lee really wants to see and really working with the guys who are going out and executing his vision of what we want to see from the Charlotte Hornets moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, the vision is a very, very, I think interesting word, especially when it comes to first year head coaches, and then how much time are you going to give them to be able to impact that vision, create a culture for whatever route you're ultimately trying to go. But Charlotte is a team that's in a state of flux. The new organization, new management, kind of at the top, new ownership, et cetera, new coach here now. And so there's just questions, nothing but questions about what this Hornet team is trying to do. Yes, they've had a lot of injuries. Grant Williams went down with an injury. Trey Mann went down with an injury. And I don't know that gets them to a point where they would have been, hunting around the play-in situation, but they're just kind of operating in the great unknown. They just didn't have a healthy roster, inclusive of Brandon Miller and inclusive of LaMelo Ball. Miles Bridges even missed time this year. So if you get those guys to play 65, 70 games kind of each, then maybe you have something that is maybe a little bit more competitive. And the league get another year as well, too, to implement some sort of style. So, I don't want to flip-flop from what I said. Hold on, let me just finish again. I don't want to flip-flop from what I said previously. But I think, even as we're talking it through, if you're going to say, hey, you know what, we're not ready to cut ourselves and cut our ties from LaMelo Ball just yet, then is it now adding that additional draft pick in with this roster and then hoping, and again, really just hoping that this team stays healthy? Or are you trying to do more just larger changes here to make the team more in the mindset of what you might think Charles Lee is looking for this roster to ultimately be?
Do you think the Charlotte Hornets have a long leash for Charles Lee? I don't want the focal point to be about the head coach, but what I'm saying is, to your point, this is not going to be a 2-year turnaround project, even with LaMelo Ball. Because I think we're saying, and we both agree, even with LaMelo Ball, the upside of success for the Charlotte Hornets will not happen in a year or two. What you can hope for is that if he's healthy enough, he can be productive. But I think you have to lean more in, what is Charles Lee going to get out of some of these other players? And here's the other thing as well, too, Shaw, because I do find it interesting that they weren't able to get rid of Mark Williams, but their intent was to get rid of both Mark Williams and Nick Richards. They were successful in moving on from Nick Richards, right? At what point do you have to start looking at the group of players that you are bringing in, whether it's the draft or whether you're pulling them in from free agency or from some of these nominal trades you're doing, and you're actually settling in that Coach Lee will extrapolate from these guys a level of professionalism and be able to contribute, whether it's role affiliated or you find a diamond in the rough? How do you see yourself giving enough time for him to be able to do something like that? Because I can at least say that when we just finished talking about a guy like Taylor Jenkins, he was able to do that. And we can't say that for a lot of head coaches, because to their demise, they probably won't be coaching much longer if you still see the same old from the way that they operate, the way that they handle things, and the way that they philosophize how they handle their bench and their role players and their development of some of these other guys.
Yeah, that would be wild to me, if they were to say, all right, hey, kind of a one and done situation, especially for a first year, individual. So I think, there's going to be some time here, I'd say at least, a 3 to 4 year run in trying to figure it out. But again, who are the players on the roster that you're having him build and try to establish some semblance of culture around? So for me, like when you have building blocks in this, well, I use that term loosely. If you have potential building blocks in LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller, you can kind of feel like, okay, just how good are they? Are these, yes, they average 20 points per game. Bridges even averaged 20 points per game, but that's because multiple guys were out and there's a lot of overlapping when guys were out. So then, the usage rate changed, in various times throughout the course of the season to kind of balance out where you have 3 20-point per game scorers. I don't know if you really have 3 20-point per game scorers on this team. And I don't know if Miles Bridges is somebody that you're trying to think about as a building block. But with Ball and Miller, it's intoxicating enough because they're both so young, 22 and 23 years old, respectively. You don't want to punt, but I don't know. I think, there's some people in Charlotte who would probably say, hey, I've seen enough of the Lamelo show to know that this isn't the guy. But what are you going to go out there and get, especially at the price tag that you've re-signed him for here now? And yeah, you'll have to match those salaries, but will somebody try to make Lamelo the reclamation project? I don't know if it's even a risk worth taking for Charlotte, but I know that they realize nothing is established in a space where they want this to be. They're not a good defense. They're not a good offense. They're not good at points in the paint. They're not, they're an okay free throw shooting team, whatever. They're not a good 3-point shooting team. Like, there's nothing that can't be improved in any capacity. So all things need to be on the table when it comes to this Charlotte Hornets team for next year.
Yeah, look, the Charlotte Hornets as a team collectively, you got to hope that something goes their way. And I want it to be something that does not have to be hyper focused on, because I think that's what does them in. That's what does them wrong. I think they're praying for this level of elevated success to happen through LaMelo Ball. And I think, to your point, and we're going all the way back to what we've been saying in the beginning, LaMelo Ball just doesn't seem to be that guy. I think there are far more other interests out there that is certainly has his antennas up, that really doesn't have anything much to do with the success of basketball. Now, maybe the success of branding and maybe the success of whatever that stuff is seems to be what's prevalent. I'm not calling him out or nothing like that, but what I'm saying is it's the facts, it's the truth. We may have had that same kind of conversation with a couple of other players whom we've had the opportunity to see come across, and that we're also seeing out there playing basketball as we speak right now. And it'll only be available for so long, because in Charlotte, listen, Queen City and everything like that, a lot going on, and you can very easily elevate your brand. But at some point, it still has to come back to that core part of why you're even in the NBA. It comes down to winning. And at some point, there's got to be accountability being held. You can get rid of all of the head coaches. You can get rid of all of the quote unquote B players, C tier players, all of them. It's still going to come down to the guys that you paid a ton of money for to go out and play at a very, very high level. And if you're not going to be available, you're not going to be able to see that your stats or your numbers are actually equating to anything successful, at some point, a change is on the horizon. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Coming up, time for us to put the Utah Jazz on the slab. Another sad note, man. Got to sit there and got to Emmy out on the Utah Jazz, but that's okay. Sad songs can be played sometimes. We'll hopefully try to play a more mellow tune for them when we autopsy him. You don't want to miss it here on The Baseline. We're back, Callie Warren Shaw, Baseline NBA podcast, and time for us to continue our coveted autopsy report. Next on the slab we have is the Utah Jazz. It's inexplicable to me, Shaw, when I think about the Utah Jazz, because a couple of years ago, man, we were talking about how what did Danny Ainge in his first year as a president of basketball operations, and kind of making all of these fly wire decisions, and this team literally like overachieved and was in the conversation of the playoffs, and then a couple of injuries happened, and all of a sudden it's just all falling apart to the extent that like they're playing like as one of the worst teams in basketball. Luckily they're not, but it's still a far cry from, because what it felt like was just maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years, feels like forever when we're talking about, the drop off for the Utah Jazz. It's inexplicable that we have to be putting them on the slab, because after the Donovan Mitchell trade and the fresh restart, they seem to turn things around pretty quickly with the assets they've acquired. And then now we've seen a stagnation of this team's not just success, but also the stagnation of this team's development. And it's really hard to put a finger on where they're going to be going, especially after another disappointing season.
Well, make no mistake about this. The Utah Jazz have decided that they want it to be bad. So they have played and toyed with their lineups to the point where, if the league really wanted to investigate, I think they could, and they have been asked, and I think fined for sitting players or resting players, against what would be competition rules, so to speak. So the Jazz are tanking. And there's no two ways about it. And I think it's one of those situations that we said even a couple of years ago where Will Hardy as a head coach is a good coach, kind of despite what the talent on the floor might ultimately be. So we need to go ahead and hinder Will a little further by just taking some of this talent away or only having certain guys available, I think, at times. Markkanen has had a very, very rough and up and down year. Definitely regressed back to, I think, his Chicago form. As opposed to the Utah form that we've seen over the last 2 years, but only played 47 games. So, how legitimate were the injuries that he had all year long? Could he have played through some of these things if they were a more competitive team? Potentially, but we don't know that. I think I told you post December, I was kind of ear hustling, at the NBA G League showcase in Orlando. And I heard, a pretty well-connected reporter talking to another pretty well-connected reporter that, hey, Hardy and Kessler aren't like the best of friends. Like Hardy just doesn't really rock with Kessler like that. So there's times Kessler hasn't played, for multiple stretches over the course of the year. And, while he's had a decent year, averaging a double-double, and I think is, one of the month leader, if not the league leader in blocks, there's that aspect. And his name has been bantered about in trade rumors as well. So for me, if you don't really sure what Markkanen is, yes, you re-signed him, so they didn't trade him, but I think his name is going to come up very, very heavily, I think, when it comes to trade potential going into the draft and obviously into the summer as well. If you don't like Kessler, then there's not, and again, Kessler's not really a building block, but then there's really no young talent here that I think is like, hey, you know what, this is a guy. You don't have the guy. If Markkanen is not it, then they don't have it on this roster, and that's not Keontae George. It's not Isaiah Collier. It's none of those guys. So I think Utah is really, really kind of struggling here and wants to be a top 2 or top 3 draft pick this year where they can get the guy that they can build around.
Well, okay, so I've followed a few games of the Utah Jazz. I've seen a vast improvement in Keontae George. I think it was a question of whether or not he was just going to be able to get minutes because, again, you look at that roster is just freaking flooded with all kinds of guards, right? And I think it would have done the Jazz well to, move a couple of those guys on if you really wanted to find out, whether or not Collier and Keontae George, couldn't be your backcourt of the future. If you clearly were not sold on Colin Sexton, as being the backcourt, leader for the team. Right. And I think this has been the problem with the Utah Jazz, Shaw. They have just, it reminds me a little bit like what we saw with the Orlando Magic. Now, kudos, because I think if you're Jamal Mosley, right, of the Orlando Magic, you had to establish a legitimate footprint. Maybe that's what we're waiting for in Will Hardy. But if there's more conversations about who you're not vibing with and who you're not rocking with, than actually having an identity in place about what kind of culture you're trying to build, what kind of system you're trying to implement in place, and kind of profiling the players who get it to go out there and execute it, regardless of the wins and losses, then we're still in that same space where it's like the Bermuda Triangle, right? Like we have no idea. We can go in a certain direction, but we really have no certainty where that direction is going to take us. And I feel like that doesn't help a guy like Will Hardy, because to your point, Will Hardy does have credibility. He is a good coach. But if you're not making an imprint, especially with the bad team that you kind of have with the Utah Jazz, it's an either or proposition. No matter what Danny Ainge does, he can get rid of all of these players, but eventually he's going to have to get rid of Will Hardy, and that to me, I think, is the disappointing part of it, is that I'm waiting to see what kind of imprint Hardy is supposed to have on this team. It shouldn't be that we're having this conversation, especially if the team sucks. I get it. 16 wins, probably will wind up having the worst record, but I'm supposed to see at least something good come from all of that. And I think that's where the message gets muddled. And I think that's where you tread very carefully, not us, but I'm just saying, for people who are trying to get an idea about what's going on with the Utah Jazz, we have to tread a little bit carefully, because I'm starting to wonder, like, did Danny Ainge really want Will Hardy to coach this team to begin with? You know what I'm saying? Like, if your overall plan was that you were trying to tank to get, quote unquote, the Cooper flag, the generational player, or whatever the case may be, let's remember too, Cooper Flag has got to be sold that the coach that I'm going to be playing for the next 3 or 4 years is going to have my best interests at heart. And whenever you go and you get other players to come play for me, these are guys that are like, you know what I'm saying? I'm just saying in general, like you're going to get a lottery guy. You're going to get a guy. You want to make sure that guy is bought into the fact that the coach that they've got in place, Danny Ainge has got confidence in, and that Will Hardy's got confidence in Danny Ainge, and so forth and so on.
Well, yeah, I don't know that I'm as concerned about the Ainge and Hardy connection as I am about the overall roster construction, short term and long term, and who will be here. So I think those guys, I don't want to say lockstep, but I think there's some sort of synergy. Hardy might be better than even whatever paltry roster Ainge is trying to put out there. So Ainge is like, all right, we got to strip it down even further. That's why I'm a little surprised that they weren't more active, or maybe they tried, but they didn't, trade Jordan Clarkson or Colin Sexton or John Collins. All the names we hear every single year are going to get moved. They didn't move any of those guys. I will say all those guys have contracts that end after next season. So they can utilize those expiring deals, I think, as salary filler, for potential deals, or to try to, I don't think you're going to get a whole lot of draft equity for some of those guys. But at the end of the day, they know after the end of next year, they're going to be basically resetting their overall books again. So I can't imagine that they wouldn't be in the same situation. Like, I mean, I would expect the Utah Jazz to be very much here again next year, even with what looks like to be a top 2 or 3 pick in this year's upcoming draft. And even if they keep Markkanen, which, again, I think it might be kind of foolish in essence to do, because Markkanen is already 27, so he's entering truly the prime of his career. So what does he give you alongside Dylan Harper or Cooper Flag right now? Like, I don't know. I think other than taking away touches from somebody who you're also ultimately trying to develop when you get one of those guys. So to me, I think the Jazz are looking to press reset immediately. I think Will Hardy and Danny Ainge are on board with what that situation is. And this roster, I mean, it has Cody Williams on it as well too. And, maybe they struck a little bit of gold in Kyle Filipowski or whatever. And, again, nice guys, nice rotational pieces per se, but, they're not the development. They're not the franchise building guys here. And that's what they're looking to try to do in this year's draft. So to me, look for Utah to completely reset this roster going into the summer with maybe a couple of veterans that they can keep, just for salary, because they got to have, the minimum salary in essence to start the season. But maybe some of those guys, will get moved on as we get to next year's trade deadline as well too.
All right, I want to ask you the confidence, the confidence question, right? So on a scale of 1 to 5, how much confidence do you have in Kessler still being a Utah Jazz?
I mean,
no confidence, 5 being utmost confidence.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with 2. I mean, the easiest thing, I'll go in the 3, but I'm gonna go with what I heard per se, and what I've seen to some degree as well. And if they have an opportunity to move him, I think they will, because if he's not a Hardy guy,
you think they'll move him more so than prioritizing re-signing or redoing anything with Markkanen?
Say that again.
What I'm saying is do you think that the priority would be to keep Kessler, move on from Markkanen, or vice versa?
I think you'd probably want to clear your books. So I think if you find a taker for Markkanen, you probably do that, because they've already re-signed Markkanen. They did that at the last part of the summer, which precluded him from being able to be traded, by the deadline. So, before you have to end up having to pay Kessler, maybe you try to move on from him before you even have to commit money in essence for whatever reason, because then you don't want to lose him for nothing as well. But I think both of those guys are hey, I don't say their days are numbered in Utah. I don't have any intel that's saying that specifically, other than the fact that I think Kessler's attitude, or I shouldn't say his attitude, something needs to change, I think, from the synergy with he and Will Hardy. If others are to be believed that, hey, Kessler can be there long term, but Markkanen, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense, especially if you get Cooper Flag. Like maybe, you can play those two alongside together, but it's I think you let Cooper or whoever be the man, as opposed to having somebody who's going to average 25 a game potentially in Lauri Markkanen.
Yeah, I think, to me, that's part of where I was kind of curious about this, Shaw. It's like, are you preparing yourself to open up this idea that you are going to go after or be in a position to get a guy like Cooper Flag? If Cooper Flag, wherever the Jazz sit in the drafting position, so to speak, are you still determined to say we're going to go back to the draft to find the future of the foundation of this organization? And listen, that may not necessarily just be a reset. That could actually just be a mindset of which Danny Ainge truly believes is the best path forward for the Utah Jazz to replenish and rebuild and bring back the glory of what made the Utah Jazz as successful as they had been during the late 1980s, going into the 90s and the early 2000s. They had core players, guys that they brought in from the draft, developed up, came in, took over, and did what they were doing, even if it was for a short stint, if it was within a 3-5 year window, whatever the case may be. I feel like maybe that is what's best suited for the Utah Jazz. The unfortunate part is I think they have missed on those type of players. And they went and they took a shot in the dark and bringing in and Markkanen, which again, it surprises me because we saw a different side of Markkanen coming over from the Bulls to the Utah Jazz and ultimately showing us that he can be an aggressive scorer. He could be I want to say not top tier, but he could definitely be a middle tier type scorer. He kind of be your Jaren Jackson Jr. guy, a 2A kind of guy, if you wanted him to. I think he has that kind of versatility. It's just the other aspects of his game you want to see more aggressiveness with, and I think that comes with pairing him with someone that can show you that level of aggression. That certainly wasn't going to be the case with Kessler. You know what I'm saying? So it'll be interesting to see what the Utah Jazz chooses to do moving forward, Shaw. But I think to your point, whatever player you get, that's why I go back to the Hardy thing, because I feel like I want to see the imprint of him having the influence on whoever their cornerstone player is going to be and how that permeates through the other guys that Danny Ainge chooses to bring on the roster. Because I don't think Danny Ainge is going to find a dude like that, whether it be free agency or he's going to pull some dude like that, from off the street, so to speak. Yeah. I really think it's going to have to be homegrown.
Yeah, I mean, and they're not a free agent destination. So like they know they're going to have to do this by trade. And I don't want to go so far as to say where I feel like, okay, well, where they get slotted in the lottery will determine their future. But in some ways, it could at least help guide some of their short-term future, because the top of the draft is kind of guard and wing heavy. Flag, you think, is more kind of a 3 and a 4 type of situation. But, Ace Bailey and others, are Dylan Harper, like those are guards and 2 guards, if you will. So I don't think they're set at that position. So they end up with one of those guys as opposed to, Cooper Flag specifically, where there could be some duplicity with what Markkanen is currently doing. Then, you can see the Keontae Georges, the Colin Sextons, if you will, too. Maybe those guys get moved on from because now you have, an Ace Bailey or Dylan Harper kind of in one of those spots. Like, I don't know. I think some of that is going to be determined. But for me, I think Utah's plan is definitely try to be bad for the next year as well, especially with those expirings, as I said. And then you'll start to see what the future and the foundation of this roster is with, I think, Will Hardy with, a pretty long leash there with Danny Ainge as well, too, in Utah.
Good stuff, man. Good stuff. Not a bad start to our autopsy report.
We kept it light. We kept it light. I mean, and these are teams that are, listen, they've been dead a long time. They've been sleepwalking, walking dead through the rest of this regular season anyway. So,
yeah, every now and again, then we just have to change. We have to update the soil. We just gotta, what I'm saying? Got to make sure the soil is fresh, man. You got, what I'm saying?
A little fertilizer on that joint. But I think at the end of the day, it's hard with these teams, but it's also easy at the same time because there's not so much there where you feel like, okay, where they're like one person, one player away. Like they're very far off from where whatever that next step is for them in terms of even like play-in contention. Like they're so far away from that. So literally everything is on the table. Like literally everything on there. They're not good offensive. They're not good defensively. Like, the only thing you can say, I think, with both of these situations in Charlotte and Utah is that you have young head coaches, not necessarily young in ages, but I think Will is actually a pretty young head coach himself in terms of age, but, inexperienced head coaches who are, trying to impact their way and create a culture for both of these teams and these rosters that will get them to that next step, proverbially so. So shout out to the Hornets and Jazz. It's been fun for some watching you this season. And it's been really interesting to watch the tank at play, especially in the case of Utah, where the tank was on very, very early.
Absolutely. Great stuff as always. And we definitely want to hear from y'all. What are your thoughts about the Charlotte Hornets and the Utah Jazz and what their future is going to possibly look like? Should we continue to keep burying them, or is there hope for us to resuscitate these two franchises back into the relevancy of the NBA. Definitely want to hear your thoughts on that and what the path forward may lead to that. For the Baseline, Callie, Warren Shaw, we appreciate you guys. You know we do. And we'll catch up with you next time.